thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join our CPF webinar. I'm Christopher Smith, and I'm the Principal and Office Director in the Pasadena Office of Architectural Resources Group. We're a full-service architecture, planning, and conservation firm established in 1980. We also have offices in San Francisco and Portland, and it's our belief that older buildings can coexist with contemporary uses in positive ways for the user and the greater community, with the goal of architecture through preservation. This often takes creative approaches, such as alternatives using the California Historical Building Code, which is one of the themes that we'll be touching on. So as many of you know, downtown Los Angeles has been going through a great renaissance of reactivation, and our focus today is on the Broadway Theater and Entertainment District in downtown, which is a National Register Historic District. Broadway was the birthplace of theatrical and cinematic entertainment in Los Angeles, and in its prime was considered the commercial and retail capital of the United States. Today is one of the nation's largest underutilized inventories of historic buildings, including a collection of some of the most magnificent theaters in the world. And hopefully many of you have gotten to enjoy the ones that are currently open. So red tape that developed over decades, impossible to comply with, or conflicting codes and a sense of reinventing the wheel with every project, stymied developers and property owners for years, hampering Broadway's redevelopment. In a joint effort with LA City Council member Jose Huizar's office, the Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety, the LA Fire Department, City Attorney's Office, and a committee of private sector architects and code experts, new historic commercial reuse guidelines were developed over a 5-year period. As a pilot program in the Bringing Back Broadway initiative, these guidelines are expected to activate dormant historic buildings on Broadway and fill more than 1 million square feet of empty floor space. They will encourage millions of dollars of investment on Broadway and increase the historic preservation of our valued resources. So on the footsteps of the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance, which was passed in 1999 and then expanded in 2003, the commercial reuse guidelines provide solutions that are reasonably equivalent to regular codes when dealing with qualified historic buildings or properties, and can be used to provide flexibility in addressing the challenges faced when historic buildings are undergoing change of use or commercial reuse. They offer a clear roadmap for developers, property owners, design professionals, and preservation consultants who may have had their own interpretations of the California Historical Building Code. So this webinar discussion will hopefully provide an overview of the 5-year process that we went through, the challenges that result from seemingly conflicting agendas and how they are transformed into a common agenda, and some of the innovative guidelines that will help transform our beautiful historic district into a vital part of downtown LA. When we presented this at CPF, the CPF conference last year, the subject was going beyond the textbook, where we also discussed going beyond the code book and the need to engage professionals, regulatory agencies, politicians, and property owners to advance preservation tools, guidelines, along with new ordinances for smart and safe development and rehabilitation of our underutilized historic building stock. So we've allotted a fair amount of time for Q&A, as Jonathan mentioned, after the presentations to explore that theme further. Our two presenters are from Los Angeles, where we're also the leaders of the task force committee that I was also proud to be a part of, which established a new set of commercial reuse guidelines for the National Register Broadway Theater and Entertainment District in the historic core of downtown Los Angeles. So our first presenter is Jessica Weddington Mclain. She's now in her 10th year serving as Executive Director for Bringing Back Broadway and Director of Downtown Economic Development for Los Angeles City Council member Jose Huizar. Bringing Back Broadway is a multifaceted 10-year plan, the 8th year, initiated and chaired by Council member Huizar. Its goals and projects range from historic preservation to economic development, urban planning and design to transportation systems, cultural arts and entertainment to marketing, retail development, capital finance, and public policy. The initiative is focused on his Broadway corridor in downtown LA, and as I mentioned, is a National Register Historic District. Jessica oversees policies and projects and coordinates the complex implementation of all aspects of the Bringing Back Broadway vision. She acts as the liaison between numerous city and public departments, agencies, civic and business organizations, and community stakeholders who work on the initiative. Jessica also handles business and economic development policy for the council member and is an active within the programs and issues related to promoting business, job creation for downtown LA's region economic engine. Jessica's very busy, it looks like. Following Jessica will be Karin Lilligren, AIA. Karin is principal and founder of Omgivning Architecture and Interior Design. I'll mention that the name Omgivning is Swedish for ambiance, setting, and environment, and is at the core of her firm. Karin developed her experience and passion for downtown LA during her 15 years with Killefer Fleming Architects. While at KFA, she was the director of adaptive reuse projects, in which she personally designed and managed through completion the conversion of 12 high-rise buildings that total over 3,000 live-work residences, the first being Tom Gilmore's Old Bank District, the last being the Roosevelt Loft. Since its inception in 2009, Karin has led Omgivning, a recognized firm in downtown Los Angeles, architecture and interior design. In 2015, Omgivning was awarded the AIA's Presidential Honoree Award for Emerging Practice. The firm's wide range of projects consist of adaptive reuse, multifamily housing, hotels, creative office, neighborhood restaurants and bars, historic theaters, and furniture design. 3 current projects that Omgivning include Broadway Trade and the Case Hotel located on Broadway, and the Sears Landmark in Boyle Heights. In the last 6 years, Omgivning has grown into a firm of 23 architects and interior designers and has provided services for over 250 buildings, primarily in downtown Los Angeles. Karin is a single mom and was a 7-year resident of downtown LA. She's active in many organizations, most notably Bringing Back Broadway, in which she poured much of her dedication to the redevelopment of these historic structures. So with all of that, I'd like to now turn it over to Jessica, and the stage is yours.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. Yeah, I guess that does make me sound kind of busy. The great part about this job is that it truly is a passion project. It's something we really enjoy. So I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about commercial reuse with all of you. Okay, first step is advancing the PowerPoint. That I don't really know how to do. Jonathan, can you give me I thought I had that and now I don't. Ah, there it is. Great. Okay. So just to give a very quick overview of what Broadway is, Chris went into it a little bit. It really is the birthplace of vaudeville entertainment. It's the birthplace of Hollywood, basically, in downtown Los Angeles. There are 12 historic theaters on the street. It's the largest collection of historic theaters on one street in the nation. And every time we say that in public, someone inevitably says, well, what about Broadway in New York? Well, in New York, they're not all on one street. They're on 42nd Street and 44th Street. On Broadway, you can stand at one street and look down and see all of the marquees on one street. It's pretty outstanding. It was the terminus for Route 66, the hub of a streetcar system. It really is an important street in downtown that had fallen into disrepair over the years. Lots of decline, lots of ground floor retail with nothing functioning above it. In an economic terms, to have ground floor retail functioning in high-rise architecture it's not really sustainable in the long run. That's where we came in. How do we activate these buildings? How do we activate the theaters? How do we make Broadway, instead of being the street people use to get from one place to another, how do we make it the destination? And A few ways that we're doing that is through the Streetscape Master Plan. It's the largest road diet ever achieved or attempted in Los Angeles. Took out 1.5 lanes of traffic, and we put in bump outs and pedestrian areas to make it a more 24-hour, very pedestrian-oriented street. We have an overlaid zone and design guide, which I'm going through quickly. Those of you who are policy wonks can, feel free to look through that. It basically regulates development, private development, what it looks like if you have a building that exists, if you do new construction, etc., how to meet the historic Secretary of Interior guidelines. It allows us to turn, something like this in the top left into this, or turn this into this. It allowed us to turn this old Woolworths that had been shuttered for quite a while into a new Ross. And it allows us to get rid of these, which do nothing for economic development. We have a facade lighting grant program. This says currently drafted. It was actually adopted by council last week, so that's been a great victory. Another 5-year project that Karin and I worked on together. So thank you, Karin. I call these my 2 baby projects because I went through 2 children while we were developing them. The children are still doing just fine. The Broadway sign district, as I mentioned, encourages historic signs and the kind of signs that would have been present on the street 40, 50 years ago. For instance, no billboards, but we do allow the open panel roof signs that I show here, painted wall signs, and the painted wall sign could have the name of the building, or it could say, as this one does, Coke. There are criteria you need to meet in order to do the off-site or revenue-generating signs, meaning your building has to be occupied. And that really is providing a carrot or an incentive to activate some of the commercial reuse guidelines that we're talking about. First, we wrote guidelines that make it easier, and now we wrote an incentive program that makes it almost irresistible, we hope, to activate these buildings. Lots of new businesses on Broadway. We're very pleased with that support. Lots of great activity. We now do an annual night on Broadway where we open the theaters and we provide entertainment in them, live entertainment up and down the street. We did this at the end of January this year, and 65,000 people showed up. Really unprecedented, a wonderful event for Los Angeles. And we have the streetcar project, which is another economic development incentive. Helps us to activate these upper floors by providing transportation and easy access. So that brings us to commercial reuse, which is our 5-year baby. That was we introduced a motion in November of 2008 to get something like this going, and we finally adopted it in 14. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, no, at the end of 13. I guess. So 5 years. And the reason that we needed it is pretty evident, I think, here in the text part, but there's 1 million square feet of vacant space on Broadway in the upper floors, and that's not counting one building that is almost 1 million square feet on its own, which is a building Karin I'll talk about in a minute, the Broadway Trade Center. But there's 1 million square feet in all of these buildings. You'll see them. They're high-rise historic buildings, very typical of a historic downtown. But most of this is empty. So you have a ground floor district functioning in high-rise architecture, and it's not sustainable. Does okay for a while, but you're completely at the whim of the retail market. When retail declines, then your whole street declines because you don't have anything else going on. And we have struggled with how do we incentivize that when a lot of these buildings were were purchased for a song decades ago, and the retail that does happen on the ground floor pretty much sustains the building economically for the owner. So there's not a lot of incentive to activate the upper floors. So how do we get that to happen? It was a 5-year process, as I mentioned. Right there is Karin. She's pushing the boulder up a hill with her nose, like me. And it was really, I joke about this timeline, because we introduced the motion in late 2008. The technical working groups convened in 2009. We had regular meetings, but very little progress in 2010. It really felt like a lot of people were kind of like signing in and doing what they needed to do because they report to city council and we asked them to come, and so they did. It was sort of the intersection of the same old, and wait a minute, you want us to change? And it was really convincing people that just because we've done things in a certain way for for basically forever, that we shouldn't just continue to do them that way. Then we reconvened. I had a baby. We reconvened on focusing on how do we implement the state historical building code, because that is a mandate. We didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We decided to focus on really that implementation because previous to that, in all of these years, the city's answer to why are we not implementing the state historical building code was, we don't like it. And that was honestly the answer, which from a policy perspective, from the council member's office, wasn't really the right answer. We needed a better answer for our historic buildings. So finally we had some success. And in 2013, we got to announce these bulletins. These new guidelines were out there in a bulletin, which you see here, a press conference to announce it in the beautiful historic Bradbury building, which if it had been required to meet every modern code known to man when it was refurbished, never would have looked like this. The open floor atriums, all of that sort of stuff was completely a no-no. But the problem was that meeting every modern code known to man in a building built in 1920 just really wasn't practical or economically feasible. So now, hopefully, it's getting easier. So what are we achieving? Upper floor reactivation. Some of the upper floors look like this now. They used to look a lot worse, very dark with a lot of pigeon droppings. This is a before and after of a building that was designed by David Gray Architects. The mural that you see here, it's called Calle Eternidad, and it's actually being relocated to the side facade of the building, which is great. So we don't lose the mural, but we do gain back these amazing mirror windows and the original facade of the building, which now looks a lot like this on the inside. So we have creative office happening, boutique hotel is happening, a lot of great activity. Karin will talk more about the Broadway Trade Center, which is a $200 million purchase of a beautiful old historic department store that had fallen into, I won't say ruin, but significant disrepair. It was the original flagship for the May Company department store that is using commercial reuse to reactivate it. I think by the time they're finished, it's probably a $500 million project. And that, you know, I'll let Karin get into some more of the specifics of how commercial reuse works and some of the important aspects of it. But just to give you an overview on bringing back Broadway and the context within which we developed this public policy, that's, you know, my great privilege to have a large part of my career spent as the executive director for an initiative that really is starting to make a difference on the street. We started 8 years ago, and I often say that we don't put public dollars into private buildings. That's not our point. It's not our goal. What we do is we make public policy that makes private investment make sense. And as policymakers, I think that's really important to focus on, because we can make all of the policies in the world that we think are a good idea, but if they don't incentivize the activity that we want, then we're really not getting anywhere, and we're not helping the owners get anywhere either. So I think that's a critical component of what we're doing and why we're doing it the way we're doing it. And then I think we move to some more of the specifics about the policies we created and why, and Karin can run you through that as from the architectural perspective as well.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to assume you can hear me. I guess someone will tell me if they can't. And I apologize, my earbuds keep falling out, so I'm going to keep playing with my ears. Thank you to Jonathan. Yeah, Kristen. Great. Great. So thank you, Jonathan, Christopher, CCF, Jessica, and especially Jessica. I mean, none of this would have been possible without her and all the many, many amazing things happening on Broadway. She is 98.8% 98% responsible for everything.
You're far too kind. Thank
you. Okay, so yeah, I started, on the first task force that we had, and I think the original idea, many of you may be familiar with the adaptive reuse ordinance. So when you do an ordinance, basically you're saying, I'm going to change code. And so, the adaptive reuse ordinance was changing code and trying to convert these existing historic high-rise buildings to residential. That was the intent, and that was extremely successful, and there was a huge stock of buildings of which needed that and have been completed, and so many more that we're even working on right now. Broadway was distinctly different, and why it kind of lagged during all that redevelopment that was happening because of the adaptive reuse ordinance was because a lot of these buildings, and this one actually is kind of, but also kind of not an example, you can see that they're more long and skinny, and they are typically box-shaped, rectangular based. They don't have a lot of light courts, or they're not U-shaped or E-shaped. Those types of buildings are great for housing. But when you have one that was typically a warehouse or a store on the upper floors, they didn't have a lot of windows, and it makes them harder to convert, certainly to housing. So the first thing that we did was a bunch of us private sector architects, did some case studies of some different types of buildings on Broadway. So I'm just going to show you one as an example of the kinds of things we're looking at. So this is 430 Broadway, and actually our firm just converted this. It opened last year, and we did end up using the adaptive reuse ordinance because it did have light courts. So anyway, success story that it got revitalized, which is great. But the first thing we did was we looked at all these different types of buildings. Why, what are their issues, and why are they difficult to convert or just to occupy, as Jessica's saying, they just were not being occupied. So for this one, we looked at, what if you wanted to put, just occupy the upper floors and maybe put an art gallery on the second floor. Now, an art gallery or a yoga studio are technically an assembly occupancy. And once you change the use of any space to an assembly occupancy, you're increasing your hazard and your risk and number of occupants. And so it triggers, pretty much full compliance of the building. So like, well, there's got to be a better way. I mean, you're taking yoga. You're not like 200 people in there partying with alcohol. And they're more limber to be able to get out of the building, And also an art gallery, you might have a big event once in a while, but for the most part, it's an art gallery. It doesn't have 600 people in there at all times. So we were kind of like, how can we just get that happen? So in looking at the buildings, just really quick diagrams of what were their issues. For example, this one, it has the classic open stair into the lobby. That's always a no-no, past the elevators. It had, I keep using my mouse. I have to use this though. It has, a fire escape in the back, and then the stair in the front. So it doesn't really have compliant exiting of two nice stairs. Like I said, this one did have a light well above, but then there's issues about ventilation into the light courts and all that kind of stuff. So again, there's a fire escape in the back, and there is a stair in the front that's open air. And then this is just kind of showing the building. A lot of the buildings, this one in particular, if you occupy the top floor, it's at 75 feet. But let's say you wanted to occupy just something small up on the roof, that would kick it into high rise. Anything where you're occupying a level above 75 feet kicks you into high rise. And that kicks you in all sorts of upgrades to the building that are, very expensive and really more about a mega high rise, like new construction, not really for these barely over high rise levels. So once they kind of identify what are the issues with these buildings, so then what we started doing was a lot of brain damage, and that's the part where Jessica was talking about, we just spun our wheels for a couple of years. We did these matrices that were very complex about all the code issues of these particular buildings and how you might solve them. But what made the adaptive reuse really clean and easy, the adaptive reuse ordinance, was you were taking a building and you were converting it to residential. So it was very clear. The new use was residential. And then within that envelope, this is what would be required. But in this scenario, well, what if we put a new bar on the roof of a two-story building versus what if you put a new bar on the roof of a high-rise? What if you just want to put a yoga studio on the second floor only? What if you want to change the use of the whole building to a hotel? I mean, there was just so many scenarios. It was a lot of brain damage. And then we're like, oh my God, if we have to change code, I mean, just think of all the red tape and bureaucratic stuff you have to go through to actually change code. So that's when we're like, ding, 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 the historic building code is a code. So yeah, so Jessica got the powers of be to push on the other powers of be to say, yeah, you have to use this code. So then we use that as the basis to work together. And basically at that point, we had a small group and we met, I don't know, what was it, every 2 times a month or once a month. And Jessica just hounded at all of us to like fine tune the language so we could all agree. So it's fire, building, private sector architects, Jessica, and then every now and then we get like mechanical in the room or something like that. But so it's pretty much a small group so we could actually make decisions and move forward. And I would say this might be a little hard to read. I'll just summarize. I think the big picture things to me that we got in there, which again, are a lot of it's just what's in the historic building code, existing uses. So anytime we could prove that there was a former use in the building, say there was originally a cafeteria in the basement, but the cafeteria hadn't been there in a long time, then many other uses, probably storage, and then they wanted to put a small restaurant in the basement or a little bar or something. It made that much easier. The next thing was the thing I was talking about, assembly occupancy. So again, if you want to put a yoga studio or art gallery or a smaller assembly occupancy that you wouldn't have to convert the whole building to current code, and that you would have more of a relaxed or appropriate review of what would be required. And max occupancy. So we got a huge pushback about reusing fire escapes on historic buildings, even though the historic building code has always said that it's okay to use them. So we came to it took many a long time to figure this out, but how can we get to use them when it's appropriate again? And so it really all came down to a backwards analysis. If the fire escape is X, Y wide, and then you have another stair that's maybe ever so many inches wide, then you're talking about an exit width. You do a backwards calculation to get the number of occupants. For the architects.
So let me jump in a little. Let me jump in on that, Karin, because the thing Karin is talking about, which is unusual in public policy, is the application of common sense. And that's really, we laugh, but it's true. What she's talking about is we have a code that says in a building that could occupy 500 people on a floor, the stairway has to be this wide. Well, the buildings were already built and the stairways were already there. So we very delicately and gently brought our colleagues in building and safety and fire along and convinced them that what we should do is not set the width of the staircase by how many people could fit on the floor, since that was impossible and the staircase was already built, but instead say the staircase is this wide, so you tell us how many people we can put on the floor. And it took a few meetings, but that kind of application of common sense really won the day, and that's how we got to this maximum occupancy thing, which is a little bit technical but ends up being super important. I just didn't want that to get lost because the application of common sense in all of this was so important.
And I think on that
Sorry
note,
for butting
Jessica, on the common sense note, is I just wanted to note as a statistic that about 90% of all of the interpretations that get challenged with the historical building code in the state of California come through or are due to the Los Angeles Fire Department. We are the strictest in the state, if not nationwide. So that added to that challenge.
Yeah, well.
Let's see, the next kind of big one was building height. So there was a restriction put back, I don't even know what year, I'm going to say 20 years, well, whenever City Hall was built. When City Hall was built, they basically said, okay, you can't build higher than 150 feet. There was a restriction, or 130, well, 150. So most of the buildings in the historic core that are high-rise are built to just at 150 feet. But everybody wants to occupy the roof these days. It's an amazing thing, and everybody wants to get up there. It's out of California. So, and that was something I think that being on the private sector, you know, I was saying, hey, everybody wants to occupy the roof. If all the roofs are at 150 feet, there's another code that says if you go above 150 feet, you get kicked into the next level of high-rise requirements. One requirement being a 20,000-gallon tank of water as a second source for water for sprinklers. So just imagine a 20,000-gallon tank that you have to add to your roof because you're 3 feet over the requirement. So that was another one that was really tough for everybody to get their head around. But once they did, then they're like, oh, wow, now you can, you know, it's reasonable to say that the existing trucks have evolved in the last 80 years and that they can pump over that amount. So that allowed a lot of occupancy on roofs that before would have been difficult. And I think the last one, which really came directly from the adaptive reuse ordinance, was smoke control. So if you are a high-rise, having smoke control that isn't as restrictive. It goes back to an old code, 92 code, which allows for more of a passive system. Well, part passive and part active. Anyway, it saves a lot of money. Okay, so I'm going to go into two buildings that we're working on. One is the Case Hotel. This is at 11th and Broadway, across from the Herald Examiner building. And originally it was built, I think, 1926. And it was originally a men's club, kind of like the athletic club in downtown LA, so familiar with that. And then it was changed uses, but similar use to YWCA over the years. Then it had been empty for a long time. And now we're converting it to a boutique hotel to the core group. We're under construction right now, which is exciting. And basically, these are just kind of showing the scope of the project. This is the ground floor. This is, oh, wait, I'm gonna use the right arrow. Oops. Okay, Broadway over there and 11th over here. There's an alley on this side, and this is a property line. So there's 3 existing elevators, and there's a stair. And so, you know, ground floor being converted to restaurant, lounge, all cool and hip and fun. And then this is the 3rd floor. It should basically have guest rooms. Guest rooms around the perimeter. Again, here's your existing stairs. Now, we put in a new stair and a new elevator, which I'll talk about in a minute, but basically there was one existing stair, and then there was a fire escape over here and a fire escape over here. The 4th floor had a historic ballroom here, which allowed us to, again, say, hey, that was an existing assembly use space, and there's a lot of little non-compliant exiting conditions on this floor, but we could say, again, hey, look at this photo. See, there was a lot of people in that space. It was definitely an assembly occupancy. So you got to give us a little bit of a break with the exiting. This is just a rendering of the building. And so some unique conditions with this building. Over here, there's a basketball court, which is a double height space, so it actually penetrates up through the 7th floor, so it's the 6th and 7th floor. And we're actually making that into a suite, which will have a really cool space in there. And then this space right here is the bottom part of a pool. There's an existing pool, which you can see on the next floor, 7th floor, in here, and we're going to make this into a big, fancy suite. So save your money for your next birthday, maybe 2 birthdays away, and you can rent this almost this whole floor and have a big party. Okay, so typical floor guest room. So you have, you know, an existing stair, which you need to walk through to get to the elevators. So that's a pretty non-compliant condition. Also, this stair didn't connect to the lower floor stair, which was over here and we looked below. And again, there was a fire escape here and here. So why didn't we use the fire escape? Well, because we wanted to do this on the roof. So once you do, oh, that looks very strange. So this is a elongated, the roof looks even bigger in this version. But once you occupy your roof, that's when you really, you know, kind of need to step up and do a bunch of stuff to code. So when I go back to the typical floor, this stair was added because of the roof use. But if we hadn't done a roof use, technically we could have reused the fire escape and reused all the existing exiting with minor upgrades, because basically, you know, there was a lot of similar use or going back to old uses, like I said, with the ballroom in that particular building. Oh, also this building was 100, by the time we occupied this roof, because we had to raise the floor in order to sink a pool in, and we were occupying the existing penthouse. So the new highest level is 163 feet. So that was 13 feet over that code of 150. So that part of the commercial reuse bulletin was really helpful. And then the smoke control and stuff also was helping us.
So let me talk about that from a fire perspective. Hold on.
Yeah.
The 150-foot thing. Karin touched on that a little bit, but we had one of those, you know, common sense meetings with fire, and we said, where did the 150-foot come from? And they said, well, that's the height of city. We didn't want anything over that because we wanted to be able to see City Hall from wherever we were downtown. And we're like, so it really isn't based on a safety measure. It's based on someone's idea to protect the vista of City Hall. Yeah. Okay, well, why is anything over 75 feet some kind of magical number too? Because there's another threshold there. And they said, well, in like 1947 or 43, that's as far as we could get our ladders up from the trucks. And we said, well, how far can you get them up now? And they're like, oh, a whole lot further. And so we kind of said, well, okay, so we still have code that puts people in a whole world of hurt at 75 feet 4 inches when you have trucks that can go way further than that. And so we sort of had that conversation, and eventually they came around, and that's when we were able to work out the 150-foot provisions. They actually went out and did a test of the PSI of their pumps and how far they could shoot water when it would be necessary, and turns out it's a whole lot further than 150 feet. So they didn't have any trouble agreeing to things that were slightly bigger than 150 feet when necessary on these buildings. But that really took cooperation from the fire department. I mean, they had to go out and test and make sure that what they were agreeing to not only made common sense, but also didn't create a health and safety issue and a fire life safety issue. And that's how they got comfortable with it. So it was a process, but they did it, and the PSIs were definitely enough to compensate for that extra space.
So the next building is Broadway Trade Building, which, as Jessica gave a little summary on, it's 1.1 million square feet. It's 2/3 of the city block. And it borders 8th Broadway and also Hill Street. It was the May Company flagship store. The first phase of it was built in 1905, and then I think it was built maybe in 4 or 5 phases in the next maybe 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
It's been primarily empty and or sweatshops with a swap meet on the ground floor for the last, I want to say, 20 years. So this is a game changer on Broadway, just because of the scale and what it will hopefully be doing. By the way, we're in construction. Some of these drawings are really old. I apologize for that. I did not put a new presentation together. So for some of the programming, we're going to bring back a whole bunch of retail on the ground floor. These are all historic photos. Obviously, this is some of the interiors of the space. And I'm actually just going to go through the plans just really quickly. So on these plans, this is Broadway, and this is 8th Street. This is Hill, and then this is right on the property line. Here, Eastern Columbia is right down here. So it's all part of that same block. So, I this will not stay in my ear, I apologize. So retail, primarily around the perimeter of the building with an interior, very large food hall court. Not food court, food hall, think Italy or Grand Central Market kind of thing. These images show, some of the direction, like the ferry building in San Francisco that we'd be going for. We're actually going to have retail on the entire second floor as well, so trying to bring some of that bigger retail back to Broadway. Third, fourth, and fifth floors are going to have full office floor plates. We're going to be cutting light courts. Again, these are old, but we're cutting 3 light courts in. That's 1, that's 2, and that's 3. It's such a huge floor plate, over 100,000 square feet, that obviously it's a pretty long way for light to get from one side of the building to the other. 6th floor is going to have a mix of a hammam, like a huge spa, social club, a gym. Now the roof, so this is the 7th floor roof, and this side is going to have a pool, an event space, this is an existing penthouse, that'll be a bar, this will be another bar, restaurant, and some other new small penthouses for restaurants and bars. So kind of a community park and garden up on the roof, and a pool, and even like it's basically its own kind of village up there. Then most likely, we're designing for 2 different program scenarios right now, but we're going to be getting a really awesome hotel, potentially 250 keys. And then the roof of that side of the building would have its own hotel pool, and 2 other restaurant bars. So it's a pretty big project, and doesn't necessarily fall into, I think, where we all started with, how do we just activate the upper floors? It's like, how can we just get these, these owners to feel comfortable in spending a little bit of money and try to give them incentives to activate. This is a much kind of bigger deal. But we did still use a lot of stuff from the commercial reuse bulletin. One thing being, this is how the roof looked, I should say, 6 months ago. Now it's all empty because this is all mechanical equipment. But originally, the roof looked like this. They actually had their own kind of farm garden up there, and had these huge shows. Now, we actually fought pretty hard with building safety. Like, we're showing former existing assembly use on the roof. They didn't actually buy it because we only had photos. You do need to have some form of documentation, even if it's a Sanborn map, that can work. Certainly a certificate of occupancy, anything like that would be your best bet. This is the basement. So we are saying, hey, the former use was retail, because it definitely was. We have documentation of that, not just in photos, but also in permits. And currently there's parking. So this is helping us play with FAR and what's considered part of FAR, because parking is not considered part of floor area. So we can kind of play with that. So this building, again, we used similar things as Case Hotel, even though it was a major renovation. The reduction in smoke control, and we were over 150 feet on this building also. I think we're at 165 at our highest level. And going back to existing uses. So I think that's the end of my story.
So I think the thing to really think about I think the thing to think about with these is that the guidelines really provide a roadmap where nothing existed before. So before, there was really no way to get building and safety and fire to agree to even things that were written in the historic building code. And now there's a roadmap, and it's a roadmap that's written on their letterhead. So it's really a powerful tool. And one of the things that, you know, as anyone who's out there as an architect or a developer knows, is it's the lack of certainty that makes things very difficult. And so the whole way along when developing this project, we really wanted to create some certainty. Can you have an occupancy on a floor that's based on a staircase width instead of the potential occupancy? Yes, you can. Can you go above 150 feet and not have to put in the, you know, $200,000 worth of extra, you know, material and equipment that may or may not even be sustainable on your historic roof? For a building like this, yes, you can. So it's really been a matter of sort of defining some of those certainties and creating a roadmap for sort of the hopes and dreams that we all had for these buildings. So that's really kind of a way to look at what we did. Karin talked about the previous use, which was important, the assembly occupancy uses, the, you know, those kinds of things. We also stair pressurization requirements and things like that can go into all these little technical things, but they based that on a 1992 or 96 code. She talked about the smoke control, but those kinds of things are not very exciting, but they're actually really meaningful when it comes to kind of trying to find a way to make a building work in a way that's also safe. And I think that, you know, our hats are off in the council office to everyone that was involved in it, because we did find that balance between what we all wanted to do, which is make the buildings activated and full of people, but in a way that our fire department and our building and safety department feel like people are safe. And that's really, really important from a city perspective, but also from a capital markets perspective. If there's a question about the safety of these investments, the capital gets a little bit chilly. So we had to answer both sides of the equation, and I think we did that in a way that really works. So Karin was a big part of this. There's another architect named Rocky Rockefeller who was a big part of this, but it really was everyone. The Los Angeles Conservancy was involved in this, the building and safety department, the fire department, tons of architects, the CRA when they were around at the very beginning. Chris was a part of it too, in trying to just pull everybody together and write these codes and bring people along. So anyway, we're open for questions and all of that too. I just wanted to kind of put that out there.
I think before we...
okay, just a reminder, this is John speaking. I wanted to remind everybody to use the chat box to ask their questions.
So is there a question now, or?
Yeah, we do have a question coming in. The question is, where can we obtain the commercial reuse bulletins and the guideline documents?
I will put a link right now and press return. There you go. How's that?
Beautiful.
I think I'm unmuted now. We don't have a chain store ordinance for Broadway. What we do have that I ran through at the very beginning, very briefly, was our community community design overlay. So rather than saying, and we have a Ross and a Gap now on Broadway, as a matter of fact, rather than saying the Ross and Gap can't come to Broadway, what we said was that Broadway won't look like the Gap. Gap has to look like Broadway. And so we regulate what the facade looks like, what the signage looks like, what the lighting looks like, all of that, so that it's in keeping with the Broadway historic core. So we're not getting your typical mall Gap here on Broadway, not by a long shot. In fact, Ross created a new blade sign, which are those tall vertical signs that go up and down the building, did a neon blade sign that they've never done anywhere else to really make it fit in with Broadway. So we don't have a anti, we don't have that ordinance, that kind of anti-chain ordinance, but we do feel like whoever comes to Broadway needs to look like Broadway and not the other way around.
Okay, great.
I'm sorry, I had to unmute myself. The question is, you mentioned that 90% of the appeals came from the LA Fire Department. Were these 90% of the appeals to the State Historic Building and Safety Board, Health and Safety Board, sorry. And the answer is yes. One of our founding principals sits on that board, and he has for quite a long time. So I guess the lowdown from him on what's coming through that board. So it's kind of an interesting. Good question, by the way.
No. I mean, that's the long and short of it. No. When we started bringing back Broadway, it was just, I tell this story because it's cute. I was in my office. I was a planning deputy at the time. So I was doing, like staffing the planning committee and doing, entitlements throughout the district. And the council member came to my office. He kind of like knocked on the door. He said, "Hey, are you busy?" Which, of course, a totally loaded question coming from, the council member is your boss. Of course, I'm very busy, but never too busy for you. So he said, "I want to take you on a walk." And we walked up and down Broadway. And I did not know we were out for a 3-hour tour, but that's it really became that. And he told me about how important Broadway was to him. It was the place where his family went back to school shopping as a child. It was the place where if he skipped school, not that he ever did, but if he had hypothetically skipped school and watched kung fu movies all day for 50 cents, that's where he would have done that if he ever did skip school. It's a meaningful corridor. And he kind of said, and he was a freshman at the time. I've been with him since the beginning. And he said, "I want to make the Broadway revitalization a core part of what I do on council. It's really important to me." So I know there have been other initiatives that have come and gone, and they've done some good things, but they haven't really lasted. I don't know why. Go figure it out. Give me an initiative that I can put forward for Broadway. So I went and I did that research, talked to people that had run Broadway initiatives before, and there have been several, and they all had the heart in the right place and achieved some great successes, but didn't quite get there for one reason or the other. And what I really determined through that was that they lacked a political champion. There wasn't anybody in City Hall saying, "We need to make public policy that make private investment on this street make sense." And the only people that can make public policy are the public policy makers. And that's the guy with his name on the door.
Okay, just a reminder, this is...
So I think, I feel very strongly that without a political champion, Broadway would have been much, 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 much slower to evolve. And probably wouldn't have evolved in exactly the same way. I mean, we've really brought an incredible coalition together to bring awareness and potential to the street. in a way that I'm very proud of. And I think that, I'll never have a better job. I know that for sure. To have been able to spend a decade of my life, on his behalf running this, it's a great honor. But to be able to see that it's really turned things around and has started to turn things around on his watch, because of the political championship, has made a huge difference.
While we're waiting for questions,
there's just a difference in calling a department and saying, hey, we want you to look at this building. We think there might be reason for exception here. This code or that code or this problem or that problem. There's a difference in that call coming from a private sector architect who's very skilled and has great relationships with everyone in the department, like Karin or Chris.
In San Francisco, we have a chain store
and someone from the council
ordinance
office.
Here. Is that
there
the
is
case
a difference
in Los Angeles? And were there challenges
so
to
if we've done
chains,
nothing
in the Broadway
but put our weight behind good things,
and Jessica, if you're answering this, I
think that's a victory. And in a lot of ways, I think we've been able to do even more than that.
I did. I wanted to see if Karin or Jessica could maybe elaborate more on some of the brain damage issues that really were part of the core. Some things that come to mind, well, first of all, that the Historical Building Code does really try to touch all facets of the code, at least in a summary format, right? So we did look at accessibility and structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all that was tied into what we did. And I think I remember being really hung up, and maybe Karin, you can go for this one, is the idea of what is a distinct hazard. That's something that is really up for interpretation and might tie back to a lot of that 90% stuff that we were also talking about.
I think, Jessica, you just moved to the brain damage case. That was just one round, one matrix that, I don't know, was 20 times back and forth. But talk about the distinct hazard thing.
You want me to talk about it? Okay. I try never to say those words together because they just make everything in my whole head hurt. This spreadsheet, these series of spreadsheets, and we put them on there like that. You don't need to know what they all say, but these are very complicated matrices and grids of equivalencies and all kinds of things. And we were making our way through all of this. However, in the California State Historical Building Code, there is a provision, a one-line sentence that was almost a fatal flaw in the whole thing, which is that except in the event of a distinct hazard, and that goes on to say, a change of use shall not constitute conformance with the current code. Right? That's why and change of use is a big deal in Los Angeles. I mean, even going from restaurant to retail, or retail to restaurant, or restaurant to yoga studio, there's all these uses and levels of use and everything else, and each one triggers a different level of compliance with the code. So if you went from, on the second floor, for instance, the current use, which was maybe a commercial office building, and you wanted to put retail, for instance, like in the Broadway Trade Center, wanted to go back to retail on the second floor. Until we discovered the ability to say that previously existing uses would be counted, we were dealing with how do we deal with change of use in these historic buildings, and this was part of the brain damage section of the exercise. And we had developed all of these equivalencies that as long as the occupancy didn't change and the fire life safety was appropriate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we could go ahead and do it. And we felt like we were making progress. But then there was this discussion of, except in the event of change of use, except in the event of a distinct hazard, a change of use shall not constitute conformance with the modern code. And it was determined by some of the technical staff within the city that a distinct hazard would be defined as anything that they felt might be unsafe. So we went through a very long exercise of what defines the word distinct. And in our view, distinct meant this pipe here that is leaking gas is a distinct hazard. I can define it, I can point to it. This stairwell here that has a hole in the 5th step is a distinct hazard. This fire escape here that is no longer affixed to the wall is a distinct hazard. I can define it. It is distinct. Some of the folks that make these decisions disagreed that it needed to be so defined and distinct, and really it was defined as anything that they felt might be unsafe. And by might be unsafe, it meant might or might not, or could not be, or might be something that they thought might be at some point maybe unsafe. And I'm being a little facetious here, but I think we were dealing with pendulum swings in terms of what was going to be acceptable and not acceptable, and there was a culture of protectiveness, which is totally understandable. These are fire life safety professionals, and their job is to protect the fire life safety, and if they don't feel it's safe, then they weren't going to okay it. And it became really evident that just about every time we decided to try to change the use in one of these buildings, there was going to be a distinct hazard of, we don't think that is safe. Not, we don't think that staircase is safe, or that window is unsafe, or this beam is unsafe, but we think the overall nature of what you're doing is unsafe, and therefore it is a distinct hazard. And that was a really interesting process to get through. I give great props to the fire life safety and building and safety professionals who got together and finally worked through that with us. And we did get through it. But at the very beginning, and if you've ever tried to push a boulder up a hill with your nose, at the very beginning is always the hard part, because there's a culture and there's a feeling that change might be unsafe. And if your job is to protect safety, you don't like that change. And that's totally understandable, and we worked through it. But yes, that is the drama of the distinct hazard. Did I cover it okay, Karen?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah.
Karen, any
I'm going to need
other...
Advil, though, because you mentioned it.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Karen, maybe
it's been a
you
while.
can kind of give us an update, a progress report based on some of your case studies. How are the departments doing when it comes to this, and not having the design team start from scratch and trying to re-educate the regulatory review process?
I think one of the things that they promised us was that there was going to be a building safety group of people, that anything that went through plan tech would automatically be going, if it was, building on Broadway, that it would automatically go into them. That definitely has not happened. There's definitely a lot of, hey, there's this bulletin, and then there's an automatic, I hate that thing, like from a plan checker. In fact, we're battling with a mechanical guy right now about this whole 92 code and the reduced smoke control. But the leadership at Building and Safety has been great, and fire department has maintained some people, or at least passed the baton so that they're knowledgeable. Yeah, specifically leadership at Building and Safety is valuable. He was a part of this process, which is great because he's still involved. Because that's what happens a lot of times. People just, they change hands, they go to a different department, they take on different assignments, and then that's kind of lost. So having him still involved in the city, and as he was so involved in it. In fact, he was the first building and safety guy that came to meetings, and Jessica and I were just, felt like we were banging our heads at that whole thing about, you guys need to start building codes. And he walks in and he goes, oh, you could use the historic building code for this issue. And we're like, what? There's somebody at Building and Safety that wants to use the historic building code, that was kind of a game changer. It really helped us move in the right direction. So, but yeah, it's been tough. And I think, honestly, I don't think we realize how much of how many developers and property owners want to activate their roofs, and use those roofs. And so that really, you do trigger a lot of stuff when you're going to activate a roof, so structurally and from a fire and safety perspective. So, that's inevitable. Oh, by the way, I want to say one other thing. The commercial reuse bulletin is the buildings and fire department will use that as a precedent for other historic buildings in the city of Los Angeles. So if you're working on another building in the city of Los Angeles, you can use that bulletin as a precedent. It's not an automatic, but again, if you weren't changing code by helping to write that bulletin, we were taking an existing code and interpreting it specific to these types of buildings. So, for developer and for a consultant, you can use that with your plan checker.
And I think there's a lesson too from the public policy perspective for those of you in the audience that are they're lawmakers and policymakers, is that it's not good enough to make a policy that everyone agrees upon and then put it up on the web and it's available there. You really do need to do the follow-up, and we've actually been talking about that here, is that maybe we do an annual education on this policy, or maybe there's this policy and a few others that really need to be sort of continually continually reminded, but also what happens in large municipalities, unfortunately, is you lose institutional knowledge. The people that created the policy then move up the ranks or retire, and that leaves people who are only left to interpret what has been written, which of course is how laws work all the time, and that may or may not be our issue when we hear about constitutional issues all the time, because we don't really know what they meant. We just know what they wrote. And I think that's important when you're dealing with a policy like this too, because everyone needs to be educated so that you don't get a plan checker that isn't that familiar with it, but instead you get a plan checker that at least last year or the year before went to a 2-hour seminar about how to deal with this bulletin. So that's something that, just on a procedural level, we're dealing with here at City Council, trying to figure out, okay, so we've made these new policies, how do we sort of filter that down to the entire staff, because there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that work in the building and safety and fire departments. And, not all of them need to be versed with every single, technical aspect of this bulletin, but some of them really do. And even dedicating a plan checker to it, which is what it is supposed to happen and will be happening again, that one person goes on vacation every once in a while. So you need to have other people that are aware and familiar with new policies like this, especially when they're innovative. So we're working on that on the policy side, but definitely a lesson learned.
Yeah, it's a great point, because we're talking about a certain density of building types in areas like Hollywood that's going through the same development pressures, redeveloping a lot of older buildings with that same mid-level vacancy crisis, right?
It's not going to end. I mean, we have hundreds of buildings that need this. So it's definitely, it's not something that was just going to be needed for a year and then those people can forget about it. This needs to be a generational education kind of thing.
Absolutely. Jessica, did you want to address the distinct hazard if the language is actually in that bulletin?
I don't remember if we knocked into that or not. I can do a quick word search. The word distinct does not appear in the bulletin. has the SHBSB ever clarified this term? That would be a Chris or Karin question. Not that I'm aware, though, that it. The question is, has the SHBSB ever clarified their definition of distinct hazard? Because, of course, it's vague enough that we had that, issue in our city. Maybe others are facing it as well.
We did. We had one of the consultants was coordinating them, and I can't remember. That was, I don't know, at least 5 years ago. So I don't remember exactly what they said, but there was a response, although it was pretty vague. It wasn't super clear, even with the clarification.
Yeah, there is currently going on a new update to the historical building code that people should be aware of.
Any idea the status of that?
I can follow up with that and make it public. I had an email from one of my colleagues, so I'm not sure the exact status of it. Karin, any other kind of lessons learned, I guess? I know that's a big term to use, but something that the audience, like another takeaway. I mean, I know we're talking, one of the interesting things I think that Jessica was talking about, something as simple as ladder height and how the technology is changing both in the way we address emergencies and security for that matter. We're living in a new era, right? And I think part of the benefit of doing these exercises is also having the agencies kind of look internally back on themselves. And it's kind of a way to kick everybody in the rear end and say, hey, look, we haven't addressed this in years, and all of these different things have changed, in addition to the need for change of economic development in buildings such as Broadway that can be revitalized if we revisit all of this stuff periodically.
I think just going back to, if you're trying to change a code, I mean, I don't even know how you go about doing it, because it is just so hard to do. And we've seen what building department trying to rewrite the whole, planning, really, planning and building for zoning, redoing the whole municipal code. And I think it's been 10 years they've been working on that, and I don't even know if they've gone anywhere. I mean, changing code is crazy hard, but taking any kind of language we have in an existing code and pushing it and pulling with it, like the historic building code is a great thing. It was almost our benefit that it was a little vague, but it allowed us to create these interpretations because it was so vague. So I don't know. So I can't imagine, honestly, any city agency saying, hey, let's on our own change some code. I mean, that's where you need politicians involved and the community pushing the politicians to make that happen, because it's hard enough just to get your plans time checked.
Right.
Reality.
And I think that has something to do with, this is technical language, right, of the difference between ordinance versus bulletin or guidelines. Right. And how taking it down maybe a notch from an ordinance can still have a great effect, but maybe with less legal hoops to go through, right?
Right. Yeah, because then you don't have any legal hoops at all, because those legal hoops have already occurred when they made the code. This is just the interpretation.
So for anybody that was looking for the guidelines, I did a new link. I think the link I posted before was from the intranet, like internal to the city. So I think what I've posted now is the external link. So somebody try it and let us know. And if not, we can certainly email it to the organization and they can email it out.
Well, maybe just to fill up a little bit of time while the question's coming in, we talk about this as a district. So the buildings are either contributors or non-contributors, and maybe our panelists can talk about whether and how it applies to only the qualified historic buildings, which are contributors, or individual historic cultural monuments, or how this applies to a common building that has possibly had major alterations over the years and is no longer a contributing resource to the district.
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm trying to remember. I think it's only for qualified buildings. Qualified buildings, correct? Or is there anyone in the district that's a contributor to the district?
Any qualified historical building, which means a contributor, someone who is eligible for the National Register, on the city register, that kind of thing, is eligible to use this this bulletin. The reason it doesn't apply to other buildings in the district, even though they are within the Broadway National Register district, but they may not be a contributor to the district, is because we did not create code. If we'd written an ordinance that Karen talked about before, we could have done it for any building within the district, but because we used the California State Historical Building Code and it defines which types of buildings are able to use that code, then we were under that definition. Had we created a new code, we could have made it any other, we could have defined the eligibility criteria ourselves.
So we have a couple of questions coming through. Karen, can you see those on your screen?
No.
The question is, did the city building department make issues of the historical building code energy conservation provisions? As example, requiring window replacements for energy conservation.
Well, window replacement is not required under the historic building code. I haven't ever had to replace any windows in buildings. It's only developer driven that sometimes they push to try to replace the windows, but otherwise, because there's no Title 24 required for existing homes.
And in fact, many times if you're doing historic tax credits, they do not want you to replace the windows. So there's sort of sometimes there is a tension. I think there is a green provision that would apply, but I think that historic is exempted from that in the city of Los Angeles. I may be incorrect, but there is something about that, but we resolved it. I don't remember specifically what the resolution was, but it wasn't related to this policy. It was separate.
Yeah, that's green building code. I'm trying to remember. I'm 90% sure we do need to still comply with that. But in terms of under the historic building code, yeah, window replacement. Yeah,
most of the green building code we do still comply with, which is, you know, perfectly fine. But if there is something about the historic tax credits and window glazing that becomes an issue. We've dealt with it a few times. I don't know the specifics though. There's also, were there any structural issues that used the HBC? You want to talk about seismic, Karen? I mean, that's a whole other.
Basically, we pretty much, but that battle was lost. I will admit that battle was lost. See, how to even summarize that? It's so complicated. I don't know if I can remember everything, but basically, while we were working on this, the state was, amending the Chapter 16, and the next code revisions were coming out at the same time that LADBS was internally getting much more strict about compliance with structural and seismic upgrades as a whole. As kind of an ideology, they wanted to increase the requirements. So we did have some structural engineers that kind of came up with their interpretations based on the historic building code and presented them. I've also independently had structural engineers do the same thing on a project-by-project basis. And pretty much little to none of those interpretations by the structural engineers were considered valid, and LADBS had a different interpretation. I can't even go into all the really technical specifics. Yeah, and it's even gotten more strict since then. So yeah, I think the seismic upgrades is not something that we were able to integrate into this.
Thank you. So with that, go ahead, John.
And while he's typing, I'll just say that, the seismic and structural, discussion, I totally understand where they're coming from. And it's hard on a public policy level to disagree when, the buildings really could collapse in the event of an earthquake or, those kinds of things. And what we've found too is that it's not necessarily even your building. And this was a catalyst for what we were doing with commercial reuse. An occupied building is safer than a vacant building. And what we were seeing was investment was happening on Broadway. And at first, the conversation was about this building. And then after we had investment on Broadway, the conversation became not about my building, but the guy next door. Because if he collapses in the event of an earthquake, he's going to burn down. And that means he's going to burn down my $75 million investment or whatever I have here. So the conversation shifted over the years, really from a one-off, kind of self-contained building discussion to sort of, okay, I've made a significant investment. What about these guys? And that helped us to be able to catalyze the policy to help these guys get activated. But it also kind of proved the point that all buildings need to be seismically and structurally safe, because the detriment to one building isn't just the detriment to that building and the occupants of that building, but in the event of a fire or other kind of catastrophe, it really does affect the buildings next to it and the investment that they've all made. So totally understand where they're coming from. I wish there was a way to make it a little easier or more economically feasible, but so far most of the buildings are able to just do it, and I think they all know that in the end, you got to be safe, and that's ultimately the end of the day. Daniel Gavahi is still typing. Type fast, Daniel.
Volunteers their time for CPF.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a great day. Thanks, CPF.